Egypt is one of the most recognizable countries on Earth, and almost all of its 114 million people live along a single river, the Nile. Look at the map and you'll see exactly what we mean. Northern Egypt is packed with major cities. Cairo, Alexandria, and Giza lead the way, and even smaller places like Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez have grown into large regional centers. But in the south, it's a different story. There's no major city, no major hub, not even one urban area with a population over 1 million. What makes it so surprising is that southern Egypt has the same Nile River, the same farmland, and just as much sunlight as the north. This is also where ancient Egypt began, where the first pharaohs ruled, and where many of the greatest temples and tombs were built. The south used to be the center of one of the world's most powerful civilizations. So why has it fallen so far behind today? Now, before you think Aswan or Luxor, yes, they exist, but they're much smaller than you probably think. Aswan has about 300,000 people, Luxor around 500,000. Compare that to Cairo's metropolitan area of over 20 million, or even Alexandria's 5 million, and you start to see the massive gap we're talking about. So today, on Across the Globe, we'll be looking into why Egypt has no major city in the south. To understand why southern Egypt is still so underdeveloped, you need to start with one key fact. Nearly all of Egypt's population lives on just 5% of the land. That tiny slice includes the Nile Valley and the Delta, the only areas with enough water and fertile soil to support large communities. But even within that 5%, not everything is equal. Upper Egypt, which is actually in the south, is a narrow stretch of valley running from Cairo to Aswan. In many places, the usable land is just a few kilometers wide, surrounded by harsh desert on both sides. It's a thin, isolated strip, not the kind of space where major cities easily grow. Here's one way to look at it. Northern Egypt opens into the wide, green Nile Delta that fans out toward the Mediterranean. Plenty of room to build and grow. But southern Egypt is stuck in a narrow valley with little space to expand. The first cataract at Aswan marks the southern edge of Egypt, and beyond that is Sudan. There's no coastline, no wide floodplain, and almost no flat land for cities to spread. The desert rises sharply on both sides of the Nile, and there's basically just one road and one railway running through the region. If you try to build beyond the river, you run straight into empty, unlivable desert. Now compare that to Lower Egypt, where the wide Nile Delta offers multiple river branches, plenty of farmland, and direct access to the Mediterranean Sea. Cities in the north have space to grow in all directions, build different kinds of economies, and stay connected to global trade. Geography alone starts to explain why the south feels so limited, but it's only part of the story. Geography plays a big role, but history is just as important. And throughout Egypt's past, one pattern stands out. Power has almost always been centered in the north. So with that said, here's something that might surprise you. Ancient Thebes, modern-day Luxor, was actually Upper Egypt's glorious New Kingdom capital. For centuries, this is where pharaohs ruled from, where massive temples were built, where Egypt's golden age thrived. The south wasn't always the forgotten region. But here's the pattern that changed everything. Almost every successive power chose northern seats of government. Memphis, Alexandria, and eventually Cairo under Ottoman rule. Ruler after ruler based themselves in Lower Egypt. This wasn't just about personal preference, it was about practical power. The north offered better access to trade routes, easier connections to the Mediterranean, and that crucial delta region we talked about earlier. When the Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD, they built Fustat, the city that would eventually become Cairo. It started as a military base, but quickly grew into the center of Islamic Egypt. That decision shaped the country for centuries. Colonial powers kept the focus in the north, and modern Egypt continued the same pattern. Today, almost every major road and rail line in Egypt leads out from Cairo, like spokes on a wheel. Over time, nearly all national projects, from government buildings to universities and airports, have been built in the north. Upper Egypt, by contrast, was left with small towns and farming villages. It wasn't just overlooked, it was left out of the country's major development plans. The north has Mediterranean coastline connecting to global trade, the broad Nile Delta where multiple cities can expand, and Cairo's strategic location where the narrow valley opens into the delta. Meanwhile, southern Egypt is landlocked, squeezed into a narrow valley between deserts. and ends at Sudan's border with limited expansion potential. When deciding where to locate major institutions, governments chose locations that can serve the most people and connect to the most places, which consistently favors the accessible, well-connected north over the geographically constrained south. But surely modern Egypt has tried to balance this out, right? Well, yes and no. And the results tell an interesting story about good intentions meeting harsh realities. In the 1990s, Egypt launched the Toshka New Valley project under President Mubarak. The plan was bold: build a 240-kilometer canal from Lake Nasser to irrigate the western desert and create a second Nile. The goal was to reclaim 2 million feddans of farmland and develop the south. But by 2010, only 16,500 feddans had been cultivated, a tiny fraction of the promise. The government canceled the second phase, and deadlines kept getting pushed back. Even under President Sisi, with new claims of reaching 500,000 feddans by 2024, that's still only 1/4 of the original target. And Toshka wasn't the only project that fell short. The Aswan High Dam, built in the 1960s, brought major benefits to Egypt, like hydroelectric power and better irrigation. But it also came at a cost. Tens of thousands of Nubians were forced to leave their ancestral homes, and no major city was built in the south to replace what was lost. Earlier dam projects had already pushed many Nubians to migrate north to cities like Cairo and Alexandria. It's a pattern. The south loses people and the north gains. Meanwhile, the north keeps getting the biggest investments. Cairo's new administrative capital, just 45 kilometers, 28 miles east of the old city, is a $40 to $45 billion project. It's meant to reduce congestion and build a modern, high-tech city. Reuters reports even more billions will be spent to double its size. Then there's the $35 billion Ras El Hikma project, which will turn part of the North Coast into a luxury resort city. Now, look at the South. Where are the new ports, the industrial zones, the futuristic cities? They're mostly missing. Critics argue that instead of piling on debt for flashy northern projects, resources should be redirected to truly develop the South. Even major national projects, like the Suez Canal expansion, are nowhere near Upper Egypt. The trend is clear. While Cairo's deserts and Egypt's coasts get new major cities and modern infrastructure, the South Nile Valley is mostly left with old irrigation systems and small rural towns. So why does this keep happening? The answer comes down to economics. And that's where things get even more complex. All of this has shaped a modern Egypt with huge internal inequalities. The differences between regions are so extreme, it can feel like you're looking at two separate countries. And the data makes it clear. Upper Egypt holds only about 25 to 40% of the country's population, but it accounts for 40 to 80% of Egypt's poor. In other words, a smaller share of the population, mostly in the south, makes up the majority of the country's poverty. One study found that nearly 80% of people in Upper Egypt live below the poverty line. Government data shows that half of rural households in the south live in extreme poverty, compared to about 27% in rural Lower Egypt. This isn't just a small difference, it's a massive divide, and it's having serious human consequences. UNICEF reports that a child in rural Upper Egypt is only half as likely to reach age 5 as one in rural Lower Egypt. This isn't just about poverty. It shows major gaps in healthcare and nutrition that shouldn't exist within the same country. The same pattern shows up in education. Nearly half of poor adults in Upper Egypt have never attended school, and about 46% of children in rural areas there never go to school at all, compared to 31% in Lower Egypt. These numbers represent more than inequality. They reflect generations of opportunity lost. Here's the surprising part. Upper Egypt isn't lacking in resources. It actually has plenty. It shares access to the Nile, has Egypt's largest solar farms, and produces major hydroelectric power from the Aswan High Dam. But despite generating so much of the country's electricity, the region still struggles with frequent power outages. During the 2023-24 rolling blackouts, Upper Egypt faced longer and more severe outages than Cairo, even though it's the one supplying much of the power. Some areas reported blackouts lasting over 10 hours. Far more than what was officially announced. It became a clear example of how the region's resources don't benefit the people who live there. The water issue tells the same story. For years, farmers in Upper Egypt grew sugarcane, a crop that needs a lot of water, on around 350,000 feddans of land. But by 2024, that number has dropped to 300,000 or less. as the government began pushing farmers to switch to sugar beets, which use less water. Even President Sisi backed the change, citing water shortages in the region. The irony? Upper Egypt sits right on the Nile, yet still faces water scarcity that's much less of a problem in the Delta. When you look at where Egypt's money goes, the pattern becomes crystal clear. Both public spending and private investment flow overwhelmingly toward Cairo and the Delta, with Cairo and Giza receiving the majority of foreign direct investment, FDI. Beyond the Nile Valley itself, almost no city in Upper Egypt has electricity-consuming industries. Most factories clustered near the Mediterranean coast or around Suez. Government data shows that Upper Egypt receives only a few percent of the country's capital formation each year. Think about that. A region that houses roughly a third of Egypt's people gets single-digit percentages of investment. This creates a vicious cycle. Without investment, there are no jobs. Without jobs, educated young people leave for Cairo or Alexandria. Without young people, there's no pressure for investment. The South gets stuck in a perpetual state of underdevelopment, while the North pulls further ahead. There's also a deeper, often unspoken part of this story, the social and cultural divide that helps keep these inequalities in place. Upper Egypt, known as the Said, has developed a distinct identity over time, with its own dialects, customs, and traditional village life. It stands in sharp contrast to the more urban and cosmopolitan North, adding another layer to the gap between the two regions. To move from shock to shock, the numbers behind Egypt's chronic underinvestment in the South are pretty brutal. Let's look at the actual budget allocations that reveal just how lopsided government priorities have become. For fiscal year 2014-15, Greater Cairo received 19.1 billion Egyptian pounds in investment funds, while all of northern Upper Egypt combined received only 3.36 billion Egyptian pounds. Think about that ratio. Cairo alone got nearly 6 times more investment than the entire northern portion of Upper Egypt. The pattern continued in subsequent years. In the 2020-21 budget, Egypt's southern upper governorates received about 4.5 billion Egyptian pounds, while central and northern Upper Egypt got just 1.1 and 1.7 billion. Most development money still goes to Cairo, Alexandria, and the Suez region, leaving southern provinces with very little. The system makes it worse. While there's a constitutional body called the Upper Egypt Development Authority, it's still run from Cairo with almost no local control. Local elections keep getting delayed, so regional officials, often appointed by the government, don't answer to local voters. The North's overwhelming advantage in universities, hospitals, and economic opportunities means that young people from Asyut, Sohag, and Minya consistently move to Cairo and Alexandria, further depleting the southern talent pool. It's a brain drain that keeps going with each generation. So, why haven't modern solutions worked? In today's connected world, it might seem like geography and history should matter less. Technology and trade should help level the playing field, right? But that's not how it works. Investment follows people, and people settle where investment happens. This creates a cycle that's hard to break. Economists call it a coordination problem. Escaping underdevelopment in places like Upper Egypt would require big, coordinated investments in infrastructure, education, and jobs. But no one wants to go first, especially with the government's shaky track record on southern mega projects. So, the region stays stuck. To see why it's so hard to change, we need to look back at the economic forces keeping this cycle in place. So here's the story in its simplest form. Geography established the scene. History locked it in, and inactivity keeps it that way. Because of the small valley in Upper Egypt, development toward the north was more alluring. Power, investment, and infrastructure were concentrated in Lower Egypt as a result of kings selecting northern capitals over thousands of years. After that pattern was formed, it started to reinforce itself. Neglect generates greater neglect, and success breeds success. You might think of this as just the natural order of things, that hot, remote regions are destined to remain underdeveloped. But that explanation falls apart when you look around the world. Singapore sits practically on the equator and became a global financial and fintech hub of innovation. Dubai transformed from desert to megacity. Even within Africa, cities like Lagos and Nairobi have grown into major urban centers despite challenging climates. The difference isn't geography or climate. It's the accumulated weight of historical choices and the economic momentum they created. The southern megacity that is missing from Egypt is more than simply a fascinating geographical oddity. It gives insight into how early advantages build up over generations, how ancient pharaohs' choices about infrastructure continue to influence current development trends, and how it takes more than simply good intentions to break free from these tough institutions. So the question isn't really why Egypt has no major city in the south. The question is, once these patterns are established, how do you break free from them? And that's a challenge facing regions all over the world, from northern Australia to southern Italy to America's rural communities. Geography may be destiny, but it's a destiny that humans write, one decision at a time. What about 50 wild facts about South Carolina you never knew?